today's mindful moment. Ever get that feeling that like American Christianity, um, especially the white evangelical, it almost feels like a John Wayne movie?
Yeah.
Like it's more than just a coincidence, right?
Right.
Today, we are diving deep into Kristin Kobes Du Mez's book, Jesus and John Wayne.
Oh, yeah.
And we're going to be exploring how this particular brand of like militant masculinity kind of came to define like a faith and maybe even a nation.
It's so fascinating how Du Mez reveals that this isn't just a recent phenomenon.
Right.
You know, she traces it all the way back to the early 20th century.
Oh, wow.
Showing how both liberal and fundamentalist Protestants were already kind of grappling with what it meant to be a quote-unquote manly Christian.
So even back then, there was this idea that like faith needed a dose of testosterone.
Absolutely.
Oh.
World War I really intensified this with debates raging over patriotism and the very concept of a Christian nation.
Oh, wow.
Liberals saw social action as the true measure of Christian manhood,
Okay.
while fundamentalists championed doctrinal purity, almost seeing themselves as these valiant defenders of true Christianity.
So they were already kind of drawing these battle lines, so to speak.
Exactly. And Du Mez points out that they even went so far as to criticize liberal theology as effeminate.
Wow. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, it highlights this early obsession with aligning masculinity with a very specific interpretation of faith.
Right.
And that obsession only becomes more pronounced after World War II.
Okay, so we're talking about like the era of Billy Graham, right?
Yeah.
It's surprising to see someone like Pat Boone in that mix, too.
It's crucial to understand the context of the Cold War here.
Okay.
Evangelicals saw themselves engaged in like a spiritual battle against godless communism.
Right.
This sense of being under siege, of defending their way of life, really became a cornerstone of their identity.
So family values were important, but it seems like there was also this emphasis on being like a Christian warrior.
Precisely. And that warrior mentality really took root as they faced new challenges in the decades that followed.
Like the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that the evangelical response was kind of complicated.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Some evangelicals genuinely supported the movement, but others, especially in the South, saw it as a direct threat to the established social order.
Right.
Du Mez argues that opposition to desegregation school busing and the expansion of government power fueled a powerful conservative backlash.
Wow.
For many, it felt like their entire way of life, their vision of America, was slipping away.
Yeah, that's a really powerful image.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the Vietnam War,
Uh-huh.
a conflict that, like, deeply divided the nation.
This is where you see a real divergence.
Okay.
While much of the country grew disillusioned with the war,
Right.
evangelicals largely doubled down on their support, framing it as a righteous struggle against communism.
So while many Americans were protesting,
Right.
evangelicals were digging in, seeing themselves as this faithful remnant protecting American values. Du Mez describes it as a stark contrast in how they perceive their role in society.
And it's here that we see the emergence of figures like John Wayne as cultural icons.
Oh, wow.
He embodied this rugged, independent, and yes, militant masculinity that resonated deeply with evangelicals.
It's interesting how his films often, with narratives of white men conquering others, mirrored their own sense of embattlement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this cultural shift coincides with the rise of the religious right and its alliance with the Republican Party.
We're talking about Nixon's Southern strategy, right?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Nixon, a shrewd politician, recognized the growing political clout of conservative evangelicals and skillfully appealed to their anxieties about race and law and order.
So he really tapped into that.
He did. It was a strategy that proved remarkably effective in drawing them into the Republican fold.
And that influence only continued to grow under Ronald Reagan.
Reagan's embrace of Christian nationalism combined with his strongman persona solidified the bond.
Right.
It's almost as if John Wayne had walked straight into the Oval Office.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how those two kind of parallel each other.
It is.
And let's not forget the emphasis on traditional gender roles that became central to this movement.
Right.
This is where we see the rise of figures like James Dobson and Phyllis Schlafly, right?
Exactly.
Those who promoted a very specific view of family and gender roles.
Exactly. Books like The Total Woman and Dare to Discipline became bestsellers, promoting a vision of male authority and female submission as God's design.
Wow.
And alongside this came the emergence of the sexual purity movement,
Right.
which emphasized female virginity and male control of sexuality.
It's striking how these teachings were intertwined with a growing backlash against feminism and the Equal Rights Amendment.
Absolutely.
It's like there's this deep-seated fear of change of anything that challenges this very rigid view of gender roles and family structures.
And all of this comes to a head in the 1990s with the rise of the Promise Keepers movement, a phenomenon that drew millions of men to stadiums across the country for rallies focused on a very specific vision of Christian manhood.
This movement,
right,
while on the surface seemed to be about reviving manly Christianity, had some surprising internal diversity, didn't it?
You're right.
Yeah.
It's as if there were these competing visions of what evangelical masculinity should look like.
Right.
And as we move into the 2000s, that tension becomes even more pronounced.
So it seems like things are kind of coming to like a head around this time.
Yeah.
It feels like we're seeing a real shift here, a doubling down on this aggressive, warrior-focused masculinity.
Yeah.
You mentioned John Eldredge earlier.
Yeah, his book Wild at Heart became incredibly influential in the early 2000s.
Okay.
Eldredge argued that men need to embrace their inner wildness, their primal urges for adventure, dominance, and risk-taking.
So it almost sounds like a Christianized version of like Fight Club. You know, this need to reclaim a lost masculinity.
There's definitely a sense of that. Yeah. And this emphasis on the warrior archetype intensifies even further after the 9/11 attacks,
right,
with the war on terror providing a new enemy for evangelical militancy to focus on.
It's like the Cold War all over again. Yeah. Only this time the enemy is radical Islam.
Exactly. Figures like LT General William G. Boykin explicitly framed the war on terror as a spiritual battle against Satan himself.
How?
And the rise of ex-Muslim speakers, some with backgrounds that have been questioned, fueled a wave of Islamophobia within evangelical circles.
So this fear of Islam becomes intertwined with support for military intervention, a distrust of global institutions, and a sense that the Christian way of life is constantly under attack.
Yeah.
It's a potent and, frankly, quite frightening mix.
And it's here that we see the truly tragic irony of the evangelical movement.
Okay.
This group, so obsessed with sexual purity, has been plagued by high-profile sex scandals involving some of its most prominent leaders.
It seems like we're seeing this play out in the news more and more these days. We're talking about figures like Ted Haggard, Mark Driscoll, and Bill Gothard.
Right.
All champions of male authority.
Yeah.
All facing accusations of abuse and hypocrisy.
It's a devastating pattern.
Yeah?
Du Mez argues that the very teachings that emphasize male dominance and female submission create environments that are ripe for abuse.
You're absolutely right. It's a deeply disturbing dynamic.
Yeah.
And the fact that many of these men retained followers, even after their transgressions came to light, speaks volumes about the power imbalances that exist within this movement.
It really does.
So how does all of this connect to the rise of Donald Trump and his surprising level of support among white evangelicals?
It's a complex question, but I think Du Mez provides some compelling insights.
Okay.
She argues that Trump, despite his personal failings, appealed to many evangelicals because he embodied the John Wayne archetype.
Right.
This image of the strong, unapologetic leader who doesn't back down from a fight.
And his rhetoric, even when it was explicitly violent, was seen as a sign of strength.
Right.
A willingness to defend Christian America from its enemies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's crucial to remember the role of racial anxieties in all of this.
Right.
The fear of others, whether it's communists, Muslims, or immigrants, has been a powerful force within white evangelicalism for decades.
Du Mez points out that this fear is often linked to a sense of white Christian nationalism. This belief that America is, at its core, a Christian nation.
Right.
And that its Christian heritage is under threat from these external forces.
It's a worldview that sees white Christians as the rightful heirs to America's legacy. And those who challenge that vision are viewed as enemies.
It's us versus them again.
Yeah, this helps explain the intense backlash against Barack Obama, the nation's first black president.
It wasn't just about his race.
Right.
But his progressive policies and perceived elitism were seen as a direct threat to the values of white evangelicalism.
Precisely. And it's in this context that we see the rise of figures like Sarah Palin and Michelle Bachmann.
Oh, yeah.
Women who, in many ways, embodied this potent blend of conservative Christianity, militant patriotism, and traditional femininity.
It's like they were setting the stage.
Yeah, they became icons for a movement that felt increasingly marginalized and under attack.
And in a way, they paved the way for Donald Trump, a man who represented the culmination of decades of cultivating this particular brand of militant patriarchal masculinity within white evangelicalism.
It really is striking.
He was, for many, the living embodiment of the John Wayne ideal.
It's a sobering realization.
Yeah.
And it raises some profound questions about the future of both American Christianity and American politics.
Right.
How do we reconcile these deeply held beliefs with the realities of a pluralistic society?
Those are big questions.
They are. How do we address the harmful consequences of this hyper-masculine vision of faith?
Those are tough questions.
They are.
And I think to fully understand what we're facing, we need to look at how these ideas have been transmitted and reinforced, not just through sermons and books, but through the entire evangelical media ecosystem.
You're right.
Yeah.
From Christian publishing houses to radio and television networks and now the internet and social media, there's a massive industry dedicated to promoting this particular vision of Christianity.
And that vision, as we've seen, is deeply intertwined with militant masculinity, traditional gender roles, and a sense of constant cultural embattlement.
It's a potent combination, and it's had a profound impact, shaping not just religious beliefs, but also political discourse, cultural norms, and even our understanding of family and gender.
Yeah.
Du Mez's book makes it abundantly clear that this is not just a story about religion, it's a story about America itself.
And it's not just about, like, the ideas themselves, right? It's about how those ideas are packaged and presented.
Right.
I'm thinking about, like, the imagery and symbolism that we see so often in, like, evangelical culture.
You're hitting on a crucial point.
Yeah.
Think about the visual shorthand that's become so prevalent. The rugged frontier masculinity embodied by figures like John Wayne. Oh, yeah.
It's almost as if he's become the unofficial patron saint of this movement.
And it's everywhere. Like, you see it on book covers, church decor, even the way some pastors dress.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how this aesthetic came to dominate.
It taps into this deep-seated yearning for a simpler time.
Yeah.
A romanticized vision of the past, where men were men.
Right.
And everyone knew their place.
It feeds into that us versus them mentality we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
The world is dangerous.
Yeah.
And it takes a strong, militant man to protect his family and faith from those outside forces.
Exactly. This imagery isn't just about aesthetics.
Yeah.
It's about power and control.
Yeah.
It helps explain why someone like Donald Trump, despite his personal failings, was so appealing to many white evangelicals.
He presented himself as like the ultimate strongman.
Yeah.
The one who would make America great again by crushing enemies both foreign and domestic.
Exactly.
Even his language, that aggressive, often violent rhetoric, was seen by many as a sign of strength. Think about how he talked about bombing the shit out of ISIS.
Right.
Or knocking the crap out of protesters.
Yeah.
That kind of language would be horrifying coming from most politicians.
Right.
But for many evangelicals, it was seen as refreshing, a sign that he was willing to fight for what they believed in.
It's disturbing to think about the role that, like, racial dynamics played in all of this.
Yeah.
That fear of others, communists, Muslims, immigrants. It's been a constant thread throughout this entire story.
And it's often intertwined with this sense of white Christian nationalism.
Right.
This belief that America is a Christian nation and that its Christian heritage is under attack.
It creates this worldview where white Christians are seen as the rightful inheritors of America's greatness.
Yeah.
And anyone who challenges that vision is seen as an enemy.
Which helps explain the intense backlash against Barack Obama.
Oh, right.
He wasn't just the first black president. He represented a progressive, multicultural vision of America that was fundamentally at odds with this idea of a white Christian nation.
And it's not just Obama. You see it in the rise of figures like Sarah Palin and Michelle Bachmann,
Right.
who combined this conservative Christianity with a fierce patriotism and a very traditional view of femininity.
Yeah, they became cultural icons for a movement that felt increasingly besieged.
And you could argue that they helped pave the way for Donald Trump,
Yes.
who in many ways was the culmination of decades of cultivating this militant, patriarchal masculinity within white evangelicalism.
Right.
He was the John Wayne ideal made flesh.
It's a lot to process.
It is.
And it raises some really uncomfortable questions about the future.
Yeah, where does this movement go from here?
What's fascinating is that Du Mez doesn't offer easy answers.
Okay.
She leaves us with this unsettling realization that the story of militant masculinity in white evangelicalism is still being written.
Yeah, it's definitely an ongoing story.
It is. It's a story that's deeply intertwined with our nation's history, with our anxieties about race and gender and power.
Right.
And it's a story that's far from over.
If this conversation has left you feeling a bit shaken, a bit disturbed, that's a good thing.
It is.
It means you're engaging with the material, wrestling with these complex ideas.
Knowledge is power even when it's uncomfortable.
Right.
And Du Mez's book offers a powerful lens through which to understand not just the evolution of American Christianity,
Right.
but the forces that continue to shape our political and cultural landscape.
So what do we do with this knowledge? What action can we take?
That's a question each of us needs to answer for ourselves.
Right.
But the first step is awareness, understanding the historical and cultural forces that have brought us to this point.
This deep dive has only scratched the surface of this complex topic.
It really has.
If you want to explore further, we strongly encourage you to read Kristin Kobes Du Mez's Jesus and John Wayne.
Yeah.
It's a truly eye-opening book
that
will challenge your assumptions and leave you thinking about the world in a whole new way.
And if you're looking for more deep dives into topics that challenge conventional wisdom, be sure to subscribe to our care and share this episode with your friends.
You can also check out the link in the show notes to purchase access to our full archive.
Yes.
You'll find hours of thought-provoking conversations, insightful analysis.
Right.
And, yes, maybe even a few shocking truths along the way.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Keep questioning.
Keep exploring and keep diving deep.